Today, the unification of Europe feels natural, logical even. The coming together of a continent bound so tightly together by religion and history. Yet, believe it or not, if you told people this would happen a mere 150 years ago in 1750, they would have laughed at you. By that time, Europe was divided between a couple of major powers: Russia, Prussia, Austria, Spain, and most prominently, France and Britain. These nations, and a variety of other powers, continually competed for political, militarily, and economic hegemony. And any time it looked like one of these powers might dominate, the others would cooperate to restore balance to the continent. Yet, it looked like the system might be breaking down after the 7 Years' War. Arguably, this was the first truly global conflict, with battles in India, in both of the Americas, in Africa, and on all the seas. For years, it looked like the conflict could have gone either way, especially with Prussia being on the brink of collapse. Yet, Russia dropping out would save them, while naval victories allowed Britain to seize the French colonial empire. Arguably, this was an upset. For centuries, France had been the dominant European force, but now Britain was coming dangerously close to a hegemonic position in colonial and commerce affairs. Humiliated, France and Spain would plot their revenge for decades. That revenge would come in North America. Britain now controlled most of the continent, but the 13 colonies were growing upset with British colonial policy, chiefly their leniency towards the Catholic Quebecois and the natives, and of course, taxation without representation. As a result, the American Revolution broke out, which presented opportunity to the French and the Spanish. The French Navy had been rebuilt to near equal the British one, and just a few lucky naval battles could have put France in a position to strike back, humiliate their rival, and restore their global power. When the American revolutionaries successfully secured control over much of coastal Quebec, Paris joined the conflict, dreaming of invasions of Ireland, India, and the Caribbean. The war was a slog, but it was never in doubt who was going to win. Despite their best efforts, Britain found themselves with no reliable allies, and they were outcompeted by the simple fact that they couldn't be everywhere at once. Even during periods where they had naval superiority, they simply couldn't threaten an invasion of France. While if France got the chance, they absolutely could threaten Britain. This allowed the French to have more ships in overseas regions, which Britain just couldn't match. Then, in the final year of the conflict, twin victories were achieved by the coalition. A British attempt at resupplying Yorktown was thwarted by French ships, leading to the capture of many British soldiers and a practical end to the North American theater. But perhaps more importantly, in the Caribbean, France and Spain were plotting an invasion of Jamaica, an island which by itself had more economic value than all of the 13 colonies. A decisive victory at the Battle of the Saints put the British Caribbean fleet out of commission. Not long after, the valuable island was officially occupied by Spain, while in Europe, the British outposts of Gibraltar and Minorca were captured too. London was left with no other option but to capitulate. Now, considering the situation and the fact that France was now in a position to threaten a full-scale invasion, the terms were relatively lenient. Their position now unholdable, nearly all of Canada was ceded to the Americans, with the exception of Newfoundland, which was valuable for its fisheries. Britain considered also attempting to keep the Hudson Bay territory, but they realized the Americans had no problem just taking it later, and thus, it was more valuable to avoid having a border with the new state altogether. In India, the French managed a return to their sphere in the south, thereby competing with the British in the north. Finally, in the Caribbean, Britain lost Florida, Jamaica, Central America, and several minor but very valuable islands. The tables had again turned, as the sun was already setting on the British Empire. Now on the surface, this all sounds like a massive French victory. But there was one issue. It was simply too late. Ever since the wars of Louis XIV, the nation had been in heavy debt, and even during peacetime, paying it off proved too difficult of a task. Now, the American Revolution had doubled this debt again. Simply put, the nation was going bankrupt. Yes, the new colonies were profitable, but not enough to restore a balanced budget in the short term. Combine that with a famine in 1788, and King Louis XVI felt forced to call a gathering of the Estates General, with the main agenda point: how do we balance this budget? As you will know, it was a total disaster. Despite making up 3% of the population, the clergy and nobility, the first and the second estate, got 66% of the votes. Of course, this was an outrage to the third estate, which was not only more numerous, but due to the development of commerce, colonies, craftsmen and cities, also more wealthy than they had ever been before. The gathering failed to even get to the point of the treasury, as the third estate pushed the point of representation until they simply stormed out, creating their own gathering. The French Revolution had begun. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. As the French Revolution began, London was jubilant. Much like how the American Revolution destroyed the British Empire, Britain hoped this would keep France busy for a while, allowing them to either seize back French colonies again, or perhaps more appealingly, strike the Spanish Empire now that their biggest ally was unstable. After all, nobody could have expected this revolution to actually go anywhere. Even as the king got captured by the revolutionaries, it was expected that an intervention from the Germanic powers would restore the status quo. It did not. The king got executed, while the minor intervention was soon expanded to include nearly all noteworthy European powers. Yet still, it was not enough, and the French sphere only expanded as a result of these wars. Even further, Napoleon Bonaparte, the father of Europe, then simply a brilliant Corsican general, launched a coup and became dictator over the state. The meager British colonial gains did not compensate for the victories France was accomplishing. After the War of the Second Coalition, it became clear that Britain couldn't keep up. Napoleon had begun an extensive shipbuilding program, and Britain, themselves near bankrupt ever since the American War, simply couldn't match their growth. Even worse, the Spanish had switched sides to France, and arguably, the French were now the masters of the sea. 1805 is now known as the disaster year for Britain. Hanover was seized, and Napoleon became interested in colonial affairs. He gained back the Louisiana territory from Spain, and brutally and regrettably crushed the Haitian Revolution. Once more, France defeated the British ships in the region, and even more British colonies fell under his grasp. Over in India, France succeeded at striking an alliance with the Marathas, and Britain's position in India became very weak. Much like a few decades ago, France and Spain threatened a full invasion of Britain, and once again, Britain felt that it had no choice but to capitulate. They suffered a few colonial losses, promised not to seek alliances with continental powers, and Hanover would remain with France. Truly, Napoleon was at the peak of his power, especially as, simultaneously with this British war, they were fighting Austria too. As a result, the Holy Roman Empire was destroyed, and Germany was now under French control as well. For a few years, Napoleon turned his mind to consolidation. He began installing his brothers across Europe. Elder brother Joseph in Naples, younger brother Louis in the Netherlands, and after the Prussians and Russians launched a final failed attempt to stop him, he even installed his youngest brother, Jerome, as King of Prussia. Rounding out his victory march, in 1810, Napoleon sought to secure Iberia. Coaxing Spain with an invasion of Portugal, he launched a conquest of the state, moving Joseph from Naples to Spain. Yet, The Spanish people resisted far more than Napoleon had ever expected, and Britain silently supported the rebels with money and guns. Years would be spent fighting on the peninsula, allowing another coalition to assemble yet again. Napoleon, who had recently married an Austrian princess and received a son from her, felt deeply and personally insulted by this war declaration. His patience with Emperor Francis had run out. Napoleon's armies went east, decisively defeating the Austrians at the Battle of Austerlitz. Immediately, the Habsburg Emperor reached out, offering to surrender. Napoleon was not interested. His armies captured Prague and then Vienna. Upon these victories, he installed his final brother, Lucien, as Archduke of Austria, after which he began pursuing the Habsburgs into Hungary. Finally, he would capture the former emperor when he tried to board a ship to Britain from Croatia. Lucien's position was now confirmed, but much like in Spain, unrest would make the territory difficult to control, with most notably the Hungarian nobles leading an independence war, with military might and large-scale concessions necessary for Lucien to stabilize his regime. Napoleon's control over the continent was now truly complete, as while the Spanish War was annoying, without organized outside support, it went nowhere. Initially, Joseph's control over the Spanish colonies was minor, but French and Spanish forces would be sent to maintain order as best as possible. There was now just one power left, which could pose a long-term threat to France: Russia. Thus, the largest mobilization seen up to this point was prepared, as close to 1 million soldiers would participate in a march to the east. But Napoleon had learned from his experiences in Hungary and Spain. Rather than a swift and decisive march on Moscow, hoping to completely destroy the Russian Empire, he would take it slower and focus instead on expanding the Polish state he had created, hoping to excite from the people of the Western Russian Empire the same violence he had himself witnessed in Spain. He brought Sweden and the Ottomans in on the coalition as he launched what would become his final major campaign of his life. The war was slow, gruesome, but methodical. Russia utilized scorched earth to make it as costly as possible for the French, but after 4 years, halting each year for a winter stop, Napoleon reached the Dnieper River, and Tsar Alexander felt forced to concede. In the peace process, Russia lost Finland, lost their Black Sea territories, and lost all the territories of the former Polish-Lithuanian state. Following this up with a final victory over Spain, relative peace could finally reign over Europe. Everybody simply had to come to terms with the dominance of the Bonapartes over some of the most powerful monarchies on the continent, and the Netherlands. Joseph, initially with French help, restored order across his colonial empire, first by force, but then also by reforms, granting more autonomy and liberty to his colonial subjects. Lucien, likewise, spent his time centralizing control over Austria, and after another brief civil war with Hungary, was in much tighter control over the region than the Habsburgs had ever been. Jerome, from Prussia, tried his best to negotiate with the lords of the Rhenish Confederation, hoping to increase his own power in Germany. Louis Bonaparte was by far the most humble, focused simply on his minor state, its inhabitants, and its modest colonial empire. And of course, at the center of it all was Napoleon, keeping it all together through reputation and military might, balancing the need of his brothers and of France, ensuring an enduring coalition just in case Britain or Russia want to gamble it all on another conflict. But he could only do so until 1824, when the Grand Emperor passed away from cancer. He was only 54 at the time, and Europe had not yet prepared for this. His successor, Napoleon II, was only 13 years old. Everybody in Europe realized that this provided opportunity for a shake-up, as the European linchpin was weakened. Enemies of the Bonapartist world order were now gathering their forces, but more importantly, The other Bonaparte monarchs were making moves to break their reliance on France and act more as independent rulers. They weren't necessarily planning to join a coalition against France, but at least they were now plotting their own plans for the future of Europe. Especially Joseph, the eldest ruling Bonaparte, in charge of arguably the second most powerful Bonaparte state, began dreaming of asserting himself as the leader of the House of Bonaparte. The first cracks were showing in the Napoleonic world order. But, perhaps surprisingly, Napoleon II swiftly dimmed those hopes. His reign was competent, first through regents, and later through his own merit. Aside from being a capable commander like his father, the young emperor had a keen interest in the rising force of industrialization. He signed treaties with his uncles, keeping Europe united in a web of alliances centered around himself. He opened up the continent further economically and ensured continual diplomatic isolation of Britain and Russia. Napoleon could rest easy. His son would maintain his legacy. That is, until he died. At only 22 years old, the emperor caught pneumonia while leading a parade to Rome. The best doctors of the continent visited the bedridden monarch for months, as the entire continent held their breath. Napoleon II was the key to European stability, and everybody knew it. For one, because France was the only Bonaparte state with the power to keep the continent united. But more importantly, because the young man did not yet have a son. According to French succession law, which Napoleon had left unaltered, since Napoleon II had no sons and he had no brothers, the throne would have to pass back a generation, meaning that Joseph, King of Spain, was now also the heir to France. This was a mild bit of irony, as about a century ago, a similar risk of a Franco-Spanish unification under the Bourbons had also caused a European crisis. In both cases, the opinion of much of Europe was the same. Under no circumstance is the unification of France and Spain desirable. For months, diplomats flew across the continent, attempting to find compromise. Efforts were made to convince Joseph to choose between France and Spain, while the throne he did not pick would then pass back to the French or the Spanish Bourbons. As you might imagine, Joseph found this profoundly insulting. Other compromises were offered by Austria and Prussia, who both basically demanded territorial expansion in exchange for their consent. This too was unacceptable to Joseph, and there was no choice left but war. The sides of the war were immensely chaotic, as Joseph failed to keep the Bonapartist world together. Spain and France were obviously the core of the alliance bloc, and most of the French subject states did remain loyal to Paris. Their war goals are hardly difficult to notice: secure a unified Franco-Spanish empire and maintain their sphere of influence. Leader of the opposing side was Britain. Their main hope was just to restore some form of normalcy to the continent, preferably by restoring the Bourbons to Spain and France, but also restoring the independence of the subject states across Europe. That left the other states of Europe to decide who to support. Austria was arguably the most torn. Lucien Bonaparte was not enthusiastic about the rise of his older brother, as he considered it a threat to his own independence. He had hoped to expand Austrian power back into Germany and Italy, potentially even participating in another partition of Poland, putting Austrian power back on par with France. With Joseph now denying peaceful concessions, obviously, joining Britain gave him the best odds at accomplishing these goals. Yet, he had to contend with more complicated dynastic politics. Joseph, as it stood, only had daughters, who weren't eligible to the French throne. This meant Lucien was next in line to the throne of France, but not to the throne of Spain, which, obviously, could mean a rather interesting Europe after the death of Joseph. Even more, Zenaide, Joseph's eldest daughter, was not only then heir to Spain, but also married to Lucien's own son, Charles Lucien. If Lucian simply let matters be and supported his brothers, the grandson of Lucian and Joseph would be the Emperor of France, King of Spain, and Archduke of Austria. Yet, what in the end swung him to the side of Britain were rumors that Joseph might try to divorce his wife now that she was too old to have children, much like Napoleon had done before with Josephine, so that Joseph could yet get a male heir to succeed him, thereby cutting out Lucian and his daughter from the line of succession. Next was Prussia, under the youngest Bonaparte, Jerome. Britain found in him the most willing of the brothers. As the youngest, while he didn't wish for the overthrow of his elder brother, he did hope that through this war he could prove himself, prove that the might of the Prussian army, now under his control, was still a force to be reckoned with. At the very least, he sought to establish Prussia east of the Rhine, ensuring that even if Joseph won out in the end, Prussia would be respected and not just be a French satellite. Russia, of course, was always going to join Britain, and for much the same reason. If nothing was done now to destroy France, Russia would soon be out of options to expand their influence, surrounded by French allies and satellites. Of course, the Tsar reasoned that even if Paris might be out of reach, he could at least press for a fourth partition of Poland. Poland itself had attempted to remain neutral, but obviously this was impossible, as Russian forces had to pass through. Sweden also joined the coalition, hoping to seize Norway from the Danes. Only 2 European states managed to remain truly neutral in the conflict: the Ottomans, who were content with simply holding their current territory, and Louis Bonaparte of Holland, who despite calls from both sides, simply had no interest in conflict at all. Finally then, all across the Atlantic lay the United States. With the Franco-Spanish Empire having such a powerful position in the Americas, relations with the United States suffered. President Andrew Jackson would decide to bring the states into the war, but surprisingly, on the side of their former overlords, Britain, who by this point had long since given up any dreams of reconquest, and begun again to profit from trade with the state. Aside from pride, Britain really no longer had a reason to oppose the Americans, and money always talks louder than pride. The diplomatic lines now being drawn, the war began a week after the death of Napoleon, starting with just Britain, and then slowly but steadily expanding as more and more nations officially threw in their lot with their respective sides. Up until the very end, Joseph had hoped to reach a deal with Lucian, but upon Austria's invasion of Bavaria, such hopes were gone. Europe was in total war once more. What became very clear, very fast, was that while Joseph was a Bonaparte, he was not a Napoleon. The early stages of the war were an unmitigated disaster. Joseph hoped to replicate his brother's style of warfare by rushing to knock out Austria, whom he considered his primary opponent. Yet, Joseph underestimated that almost 2 decades had passed since Napoleon's biggest victories. The armies of Europe had adapted and were far stronger than they had been in the past, and the French armies were lacking their greatest asset. The invasion of Austria failed decisively. Thousands of soldiers were lost, and it allowed Austria to seize the initiative, while giving Prussia and Russia the time to defeat Poland and consolidate their lines. Yet further, in the American theater, Florida and New Orleans had already fallen to the Americans, while successful British invasions rocked the Caribbean. By the 3rd year of the conflict, Denmark had been forced to leave the war, and the coalition had pushed up to the Rhine. Even worse, Naples had swapped sides, and Austrian forces were marching down the Italian peninsula. There was little doubt, Joseph was going to lose this war, and he began reaching out for a negotiated peace, offering a treaty along the current lines of control. Britain, sensing weakness, refused. He then offered Russia Poland in exchange for them leaving the war. Russia simply responded that they already had Poland, and good luck pushing them out. Sweden did agree to leave the war, having already achieved their goal of capturing Norway. But this did little to change the balance of power. It was at this point that Lucian reached out to Joseph himself with a proposal. Austria would leave the war right now under 3 conditions. Joseph had to give up the entirety of the Kingdom of Italy and southern Germany to Austria. Even more, he had to promise never to remarry, something he had indeed been looking to do, and he had to promise to respect the succession rights of Lucian and his son to France. Not in any position to negotiate, Joseph, of course, accepted. With Austria out of the war, the coalition no longer had any hope of actually invading France. And after the French reconquered Naples, both sides finally sued for peace. And Europe would be totally reshaped. Joseph officially unified his 2 administrations, yet kept his promise to Lucian. Upon his death, France was to go to Lucian or his son, while Spain would go to his daughter. Then the previously mentioned expansions of Austria were implemented, with further direct annexations by the Austrians. During the war, Joseph had also directly annexed Tuscany and the Papal States, and they would trade minor territories with Austria to make the borders contiguous. In Germany, French power would be completely destroyed. Jerome achieved his dream of solidifying along the Rhine, while he kept an independent Saxon puppet intact, arguing this would give him the legitimacy to strike south in the future. He also benefited from the collapse of Denmark as Sweden came to dominate the north. Poland, of course, could again not save itself from a partition. Colonially, France also wasn't spared. Britain returned to the Caribbean in force, while the Americans crossed the continent, seizing the north of New Spain, destabilizing the Spanish Empire yet further. Europe could now, again, finally enjoy a bit of peace. But once more, everybody knew that the death of the French monarch would cause yet another war. As if nobody acted, we would soon see the Franco-Austro-Spanish Empire form. Yet, Joseph would live all the way up to 76 years old, even outliving his younger brother Lucian. All Europe's efforts in these decades of peace were spent ensuring the best possible position in the upcoming conflict. For what remained of the coalition, this would be the final opportunity to restore anything symbolizing balance to the continent. For the Bonapartes, it was the final hurdle in securing their hegemony over Europe. But of course, I don't need to tell you who, in the end, won these Bonaparte wars. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.